My name is actually, it's Tobias, but that's a Hebrew name, actually, and I'm Roman Catholic. It comes from the book of Tobit, and when I went to divinity school, before I went to graduate school, I learned about where my name came from because I never knew. And I went home to my mother one time, and I said, well, I now know where you got my name from the book of Tobit, and it's a Hebrew name. And she said, what are you talking about? I'm originally from northern Ohio, right by the Indiana line. I was born in a little town called Hicksville, Ohio. I know there's a Hicksville, New York as well, but Hicksville, Ohio is where I was born. And there's Amish communities nearby, and my mom said that she got my name from the Amish. She just liked the name. So I'm here. You can call me Tobias, or people always wonder, Toby or not Toby. You can call me that. There's the humor. I'll try to stop. No pop quiz. Up here, the slideshow, you can see it over there. I know it's a little small in places. Some of this is meant to be humorous. I found it on the internet. But some of it is for real. That one right there with the AR-15. And Jesus said, if you don't have an AR-15, sell your coat and buy one. Jesus said something about a sword in Luke 22:36. This is before the arrest in the garden, and one of the disciples said, they were asking him, about what's going to happen. He said, you have to sell your coat, you have to be ready, things are going to get bad. And he said, if you have a sword, you need to have two. But he was talking metaphorically, that this is a very dangerous moment. But there are some Christians who take that literally, and now they've updated it with this rifle that's used in many of the mass murders that we hear about in the news, unfortunately. That one down there is a bumper sticker. If Jesus had a gun, he'd still be alive today. That is a real bumper sticker that's out there. So some of these are for real, some of these are not. Some of these are supposed to be humorous, like WWJS. You may have heard once upon a time WWJD. It's not we want Jack Daniels. It's what would Jesus do? Well, some people ask, who would Jesus shoot? Now, these are important questions to me because, before I go into it, I just want to say, peace be with you. All right, some of you probably feel like saying, and also with you, or also with your spirit. So a lot of us, shalom, we say peace. This is something that goes back in our traditions. We greet one another, not only when we gather for worship, but even in the streets. We greet each other with a sign of peace. And that's me, right there with the Pope Francis. I just thought I'd put that up there to see if you're still awake. That was a year ago. But sign of peace. Shalom. I hope that most of you felt kind of the impulse to say that, and that's good. Now, why do I care? I was born in 1965, the year that Vatican II ended. Those are pictures of me in kindergarten, first grade, I think. I couldn't get pictures of me that my mom's got in Florida, but I used to dress up like Ralphie in that Christmas Story movie. Cowboy hat, guns, I used to play cops and robbers, I used to play army all the time. I couldn't wait till I got my first BB gun. Rural Ohio, rural Indiana. I'd go out and try to shoot a squirrel. I never succeeded. I never put my eye out like that little boy. His mom said he would put his eye out if he got a BB gun. But I had a fascination with guns when I was a child. Watching movies, war movies, cops and robbers movies. This was something in the late 60s and the 70s. It was part of our culture. That's me when I was 19. That's my mother. She ended up being a homicide detective. She's been on A&E, Discovery Channel, and the History Channel for cold cases shows. She's got a different last name than I do because she remarried. And she once was runner-up for Deputy Sheriff of the Year for the whole state of Florida. As was said in the introduction, I always wanted to go to college, but I was thinking about law school. Part of me was thinking about priesthood. I liked girls, even if they didn't like me, so I decided I was going to go towards law school more. And so during undergraduate at the University of South Florida, I worked full-time for the same department where my mom worked. I worked in the maximum security jail. Later on, I ended up doing some patrol. But I remember being asked about would I really shoot and kill someone. And I also have seen people who have been the victims of guns. I've seen people who have been murdered, and I've met with people who have been accused of murder. My first job 20 years ago as a professor of ethics, so instead of priesthood, I ended up getting married, and instead of law school, I became interested in the ethics of the use of force. And so my first job 20 years ago as a professor was in Des Moines, Iowa, and they had me teach ethics for the Des Moines Police Department. And they gave me a uniform and a 9mm, and it was Sig Sauer, and that's my wife now. So I patrolled there, and I taught during the day, and I patrolled in my free time. My dissertation at the University of Notre Dame was on the use of force in policing. My first published article, John Jay School of Criminal Justice here in New York. They have a journal called Criminal Justice Ethics. My first article was The Perpetrator as Person, Deadly Force and Just War Theory. And then, well, a few years ago, Ferguson happened in St. Louis, where I've been for 13 years now. And during a faculty department meeting, I wrote an article that was the cover story for the Christian Century magazine on what's going on in Ferguson and how militarization of the police have been a problem. Vatican II, one of the things it said is that the church needs to look at the signs of the times, the joys and sorrows of the world, and try to address them in the light of the gospel. Signs, signs, everywhere there are signs, and here's some of the stats that I pulled up, and there I could have more. 96 U.S. citizens are killed with guns daily. I could list, I don't have enough slides for all the mass shootings we've had in recent years. We now have more firearms in the United States than we have citizens. By the way, half of those 300 million plus firearms are owned only by 3% of the people. So there's some people with a lot of weapons. But there's a lot of weapons in this country. We have more than any other country. 40%, almost half, are sold without background checks. 13 million U.S. citizens have concealed carry permits in all 50 states now. Missouri, where I am, we have the stand your ground stuff, like Florida, but we also now can openly carry. There's 5 million of those AR-15 type rifles in the United States right now. Now, interestingly, 60% of gun deaths each year are suicides. So we have an ongoing problem even if we don't take into consideration the mass shootings. Why do people have these guns in this country of ours? Well, I've been doing a lot of reading. In fact, I'm working on a book on this very topic, and in my reading, there seems to be a lot of fear. Fear of outsiders, fear of fellow citizens, fear of the other. Sense of insecurity, a lack of trust. You can't trust your fellow citizens. You can't trust those that you don't think are your fellow citizens. You can't even trust the police. You can't trust your government. There's a sense of isolation, too. Many years ago, there was a book by Robert Putnam called Bowling Alone about how Americans were less social than we used to be. We're much more individualistic, and we're much more isolated. This is interesting here. Among 2/3 of white evangelical Protestants who say the term pro-life describes them very well, 64% are opposed to stricter gun control laws, while 33% favor them. Catholics are the opposite. Among the 4 of 10 Catholics who say that pro-life applies to them, 61% support stricter gun control laws, and 33% oppose them. Most Protestants in the United States are also for gun laws now, gun regulations. It's really the evangelical, mainly white Protestants who are supporting more guns, gun rights, less gun control. Now, this is small print here, but U.S. Catholic just this year, it's a magazine published out of Chicago, did a survey. 1,388 U.S. Catholic readers surveyed. 88% own a gun or know someone who does. 32% say primarily for hunting. 32% say for protection. 18% for fun. 88% worry regularly about gun violence. 87% worry about children's safety in schools. But only 22% are still shocked when they hear of a mass shooting at a school, church, or other public space. 83% think gun regulation legislation should be stricter. 60% would be willing to give up their right to own a firearm. America Magazine, which is a national Jesuit magazine published in New York City, their editors actually a few years ago called for the repeal of the Second Amendment. 72% say gun control is a Catholic issue. 21% have spoken up about it at their parish, but only 17% have heard a priest or someone speak about it in a homily or a sermon. Now, Jesus, Catholics believe, Christians believe, is the Prince of Peace. He greeted people all the time with shalom. After his resurrection, when the disciples were in fear, shalom, peace be with you. Now, the earliest Christians took that to mean they had to be completely nonviolent, pacifist. They refused to serve in the military, they refused to serve in the police, or anything that might have to do with killing for about the first 300 years. And then with Augustine and Aquinas and others, and as Christianity spread, we started allowing for Christians to serve in those kinds of roles. But it wasn't to be like a Rambo and anything goes. You had to use force as a last resort. You had to do it only in defense of the innocent. There are certain rules of engagement that applied. But we're all called to be peacemakers. So I just talked about the Christian perspectives. Drawing on Scripture and the tradition, Christians today, they can be either pacifists, nonviolent peacemakers, or they can be just war peacemakers that are, war only if it's really just war. But they're not supposed to be militarist. That was more like a crusade approach in the history. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, and this has come up lately with regard to the issue of capital punishment. Pope Francis just recently has now said that capital punishment is inadmissible, no longer morally justified. Well, partly that's because of this right here. Capital punishment, or any type of use of force, deadly force, is supposed to be the legitimate defense of persons and societies. And the act of defense can have a double effect: the preservation of one's own life and the killing of the aggressor. The preservation of your life is to be intended. The death of the aggressor is not to be intended. So how can you do death penalty really to protect society and it not be intended, is what Pope Francis is saying. Now, at Des Moines Police Academy, where I used to teach, other instructors actually used to teach the police officers there, shoot, center, mass, but your intent is not to kill. You might foresee that's probable, but your intent is not to kill. That's the only way you can stop that suspect from harming yourself or someone else. That goes back to Thomas Aquinas and the tradition, actually. And this is why a lot of police officers, as well as civilians who kill someone, usually experience something that we now call moral injury. So legitimate defense is fine, preserving common good, but only if we have a duty for our family, for society, can we use lethal force. What about the Second Amendment? Some people in response to that survey said, the right to protect myself and my loved ones, I've got to maintain that right. And in the Catholic and the Christian tradition, there is a right to defense. But there never has been a right to bear arms. Now, to defend oneself might mean you have to have some form of a weapon, but not just any kind of weapon. So throughout the history, there are weapons that were banned, from the crossbow to other weapons that might cause too much damage or might be too indiscriminate. So weapons have always been regulated. So there's a lot of scholarship on the Second Amendment now about its original intent. Who does it apply to? Is it individual that has a right, or was it about militias? The jury is out on that. The Supreme Court has ruled it means individuals have a right to bear arms. But this last book here, Loaded, that talks about at the time that amendment came about, it was also for slave patrols. It was also for those who had to, take more Indian lands. So there's a lot of issues of race that scholars are bringing up as well. So what about the weapon itself? As I said, in the Catholic and the Christian tradition, you're not supposed to intend the death of the other. Your intention is just to protect yourself or others from harm. Well, maybe a Smith & Wesson 38 can do that. But what about the AR-15, which has 30 rounds, which destroys a person's body? That is designed and built specifically to kill as many people as possible. And yet there are Christians, apparently, that say they need that sort of a weapon, Second Amendment right, to defend themselves. I don't understand that. Rosemary Berger for Sojourners Magazine, she says, guns have one purpose, to kill. Gun manufacturers have one purpose, profit. In the Christian tradition, people come before profit. Catholic social teaching, contrary to those other things about fear and individualism, we talk about the common good. And rights are important, but they are not absolute. We talk about solidarity and sanctity of life, and yes, to protect, but try to do so in peaceful ways if possible. What ought to be done? Most of the authors I'm reading, some say, total ban. Some say total absolute rights. A lot of the literature now is saying, it doesn't have to be an either or, one extreme or the other. As we've seen, Americans have always had both gun rights and gun control. So maybe there's a way that we can steer a course through these two extremes that often seem to be the ones that get the sound bites. Can we control through legislation ammo, the assault weapons, the high-capacity magazines, the bump stocks? Can we do universal background checks, age limits, stuff like that? There's a lot of things that we can do. Now it seems, I must say, it might seem like something to be pessimistic about, but we shouldn't despair. People used to say, we can't change things when it came to slavery. Or one of these books actually goes into the dueling movement that we used to have. People used to duel. And actually, it took movement to overturn that and get rid of that practice once upon this time in this society. And who were the people that started these movements? Religious folks. Our communities. We have moral power. And that's something that it seems like a lot of literature says that we need to tap into more and more. And that's why more bishops, even Pope Francis, other religious leaders are speaking out on this issue and saying this is as much a pro-life issue as other issues that usually come to mind when you hear the word pro-life. I'll end with this from the Hebrew Scriptures, Deuteronomy 22:8. When you build a new house, you shall make a parapet for your roof, otherwise you might have blood guilt on your house, if anyone should fall from it. The editors from Christian Century magazine, they used that text to say that's as applicable to guns as to houses. If the things you want to build and possess present a life-threatening hazard to your neighbors, you need to take steps to eliminate that danger. Otherwise, you're guilty of a sin of omission. Thank you very much.
It's good to be here with you. on this important issue. I want to tell you a little bit about myself and about the work that I do. My presentation is largely focused on a particular strategy to reducing gun violence, and if you're interested, we can talk more after tonight as well. So our campaign is called Do Not Stand Idly By, and I'm going to say a little bit more about it and the context of our organization. We heard a little bit already from Dr. Winright about why this is an issue that people of faith might care about. Unfortunately, so many of us have people in our communities who've been affected by gun violence. How many people here feel that in whatever way you would define this, that you have been affected by gun violence? Raise your hand if you feel like you've been affected in some way by gun violence. And people have all kinds of stories about why they have been affected, either because they know someone personally who's been a victim of gun violence, or because they're afraid to go to the movie theater, or they're afraid to go visit their congressperson, or they're afraid to send their kids to school because there's been so much gun violence in America. For me, gun violence is something I cared about growing up as a Jewish kid in suburban Chicago. I cared about it like I cared about a lot of issues that I wanted to see if I could make a difference on in the world, and it's one of the reasons why I became a rabbi. But in 1999, in January of 1999, this issue that I cared about from a theoretical perspective all of a sudden became much more personal when my father was murdered at his place of business in Chicago. When I had been ordained a rabbi just 6 months, and my son, Ari, who was the first grandchild on either side of my family, of our families, was just short of a year old. And so this issue of gun violence that I cared about from a theoretical perspective suddenly became much more personal, as it has become for so many Americans. And it's only in recent years that I've begun to really work on this issue, because I had a lot of work to do to take care of myself and my family and my mom. And she's doing okay, but so many Americans have been affected by this issue that it became something that I wanted to see if I could work on in some powerful and meaningful way. And that's what brought me here tonight in a lot of ways. So we have, as we've heard, this religious and moral imperative not to stand idly by while our neighbors bleed, right? So this is a passage that comes to us from the book of Leviticus. And it's something that resonates with us for all kinds of issues that we might care about. The question is, when it comes to gun violence, what could we possibly do? How do we as people of faith respond to this religious and moral imperative when it comes to gun violence? And so we've heard statistics, and there's all kinds of ways to look at the statistics. And Dr. Winright shared some powerful ones. This one always resonates with me, that 1.5 million Americans have died by guns since 1968, which is more than all of the American soldiers that have died in America's wars since 1776. The numbers are astounding and breathtaking and overwhelming. And here's the thing, my friends. I just have to believe 38,000 Americans are dying every year or more by gun violence, and I have to believe that if 38,000 Americans were dying in a war, we wouldn't just stand idly by, right? We wouldn't just say, oh, this is what it means to be American. We would do something. Well, my friends, 38,000 Americans are dying by gun every year, and so far we seem to just accept year after year that this is just the price of being an American. This is the price of freedom. This is the price of having such easy access to weapons. And I don't know about you, but I just feel like I cannot stand idly by anymore. We've seen some of these statistics before about homicides and suicides. We hear so often, so sadly often, about mass shootings in this country, and they are terrible and horrendous and shocking every time, although Dr. Winright shared statistics that people are less and less shocked, it seems, each time we hear about a mass shooting. But when we look at these numbers, we realize that the vast majority of Americans who die by gun don't die in a mass shooting, right? My father's murder did not even make one column inch of news in the Chicago Tribune when he was killed. So we care about each and every person that's been affected by gun violence. And even though mass shootings are the ones that draw our attention, it's a slow scourge in America, most of which we never hear about on the issue of gun violence. So there are three challenges that I see when it comes to gun violence prevention. One is, how do we find common ground? People of different religious traditions, people who have different political attitudes, can we find common ground on the issue of gun violence? How do we sustain our efforts when it gets difficult? There are powerful forces on the other side that don't have an investment in reducing gun violence. As we've heard, they're interested in profit, and profit and money is powerful. So, and there are organizations on the other side, like the National Rifle Association, that have real power. So when it gets hard, how do we stay in it, and how can we win ultimately? So these are the three questions that we wrestle with. My hope is that we have common ground, that when more than 30,000 Americans are dying by gun, that we shouldn't stand idly by, that guns should be more difficult to get for those with violent or criminal histories, and more difficult for children to get and shoot. I hope we can agree on these things, and that police shouldn't face superior firepower from civilians. These are the things that we are basing our assumptions. We are assuming that we can agree on these things. I hope that we can. The question is, how do we sustain our efforts when it gets hard? This campaign that I am a part of, that our congregation is a part of, is a campaign that was started by the Industrial Areas Foundation, which is one of the nation's oldest and largest community organization. It was started in Chicago more than 75 years ago, and it works on a whole bunch of issues. We're not a gun violence prevention organization. We work on issues that people of faith care about. Right now in New York City, we're working on a public housing campaign, getting the New York City Housing Authority to clean up, to spend billions of dollars to clean up public housing. We're working on a campaign to address the issue of mass incarceration, specifically the misincarceration of people with mental illness. So we work on all kinds of issues. And we have 65 organizations across the United States, as well as organizations in Canada, Australia, the UK, and Germany. And so after Newtown, we started to try and figure out, was there something we could do specifically around the issue of gun violence? We did a power analysis, because if you can't figure out who has the power to make change that you want to see, you can't win, right? If you don't know who can make the change that you want, you cannot win. And then once you know who has the power to make the change, you have to figure out how you're going to get them to make that change. Because if you can't convince them, incentivize them to make the change, you can't win. So after Newtown, we started to think about these kinds of questions, and that led us to the work that we do now. So let's do a little test. There is a quiz. Sorry. The professor didn't give you a quiz, but the rabbi's going to give you a quiz. So let's talk about the people who have power to reduce gun violence in America. The people who work in this building, they have power to reduce gun violence in America. Congress has power. This person has power, and whoever sits in the White House has power to reduce gun violence. They can do real things. They could pass laws that would reduce gun violence in America. And since Newtown, almost no legislation has passed in this building or the building where that guy lives that will make us safer. But they could. They could pass laws like the laws that Dr. Winright referenced that would reduce gun violence in America. Okay, so you know those people. Let's think about these people. All right, anybody know who those guys are? If you know who these guys are, you get bonus points. You should know. They don't want you to know who they are. That guy on the left is James Debney. He's the CEO of Smith & Wesson. The guy on the right is Gaston Glock, who founded Glock, a gun company. It's called, police in America call Glock the perfect gun. That's Gaston Glock. That's Ron Cohen on the left, nice Jewish boy, Israeli boy, the CEO of Sturm Ruger. And that's Ugo Beretta, the founder of Beretta. These four men and their companies have made the vast majority of the millions of guns that exist in this country. And what we noticed when we did our power analysis is that while everybody was talking about Congress and the president, no one was talking about these guys. We didn't know who they were, and they like it that way. They want to be anonymous. They want to say they have nothing to do with this problem, and we'd like to make the problem of gun violence their problem as well. We have lots of things that we need to do. We need to pass laws. We need to address the issues of mental health in this country, all those kinds of things, but we also need to ask these men to do what they can do to reduce gun violence. So that's the focus of our campaign, these guys, their companies. And the question is, what can they do? And we think they can do two basic things. They can control their worst dealers. The vast majority of gun stores in this country are responsible. They follow local and state laws. They never have a crime gun traced to their stores. But something like 1% of gun stores in America are responsible for the sale of 60% of guns that turn up in crime scenes. And 5% of stores are responsible for almost all the guns that turn up in crime scenes. So if the manufacturers could control their bad apple dealers, decide they're not going to do business with their bad apple dealers anymore, unless they follow local laws and state laws and train their employees to recognize straw purchasers, if the manufacturers decided to stop doing business with these bad apple dealers, the problem of gun violence would be dramatically affected, would be dramatically reduced. And the manufacturers have the power to do that. The manufacturers of the people of the chairs that you're sitting in, those manufacturers decided which stores they were going to sell them in, right? So the manufacturers of guns can decide which stores they're going to sell their guns through. And if they decided not to do business with the bad apple dealers, it would dramatically affect the problem of gun violence. They can also innovate, do research and development into what's called smart gun technology. Smart guns are guns that can only be fired by authorized users. They either recognize your handprint or your thumbprint like your iPhone might, or there could be a computer chip in the gun and a computer chip in a ring or a pin or a bracelet. And if the gun is further than a few millimeters away, inches away from the gun won't fire. Why would that be important? We hear way too many stories of 2-year-olds finding mommy's gun in the back seat of the car and they shoot themselves or their playmates or mommy. Also, people who, we heard about the issue of suicide by gun. Many people know who are in a place of emotional distress, know there's a gun in the home, and they use it to harm themselves or other people. And also, we believe there's applications for law enforcement, right? We sometimes hear, and Dr. Winright was telling us a story over dinner about the times when law enforcement officers are disarmed and shot with their own gun. If the gun was personalized to that officer, then that we would have far fewer incidences of that. Perhaps the episode in Ferguson, right, where the police officer felt the need to shoot Mike Brown because he was afraid that Mike Brown was going to grab his gun, right? That's my understanding of that story. If that gun was personalized to that officer, maybe Mike Brown is alive today. So manufacturers can do these two things. They can control their worst dealers and they can innovate. And the good news is they can do these things without another law being passed. Because in that building, Congress, there's not a lot of laws being passed to help reduce gun violence. So they can do these things without another law being passed, but they're not going to do them just because it's right. They're not going to do it just because my father was murdered or 38,000 Americans are dying every year by gun. They're not going to do it because we have a passage in the book of Leviticus that says, do not stand idly by. They're just not going to do it because it's right. And frankly, it should be enough that we're right? Shouldn't it be enough that we're right, that we have moral suasion, that we have biblical texts that tell us what to do? Unfortunately, it's not enough to be right sometimes when you want to make change. You also have to be powerful. So we started off by meeting with the CEOs of these companies where we could. It wasn't so easy. They didn't exactly invite a bunch of rabbis and ministers over for coffee. So we decided to do something crazy a few years ago. We bought a booth at Europe's largest gun show, which happens to be in Nuremberg, Germany. Perhaps that's resonant for you. I'm sure it's coincidental that Europe's largest gun show is on the Nazi party marching grounds in Nuremberg, Germany. So there's us, a bunch of ministers and rabbis and an imam. That's our booth. And right next door we had our friends from Sig Sauer and Taser, and we spent 4 days on the floor of the gun show there. That was a super interesting time for us. Everybody else was selling these dangerous pokey things. We were just looking for a better gun manufacturer. And there we started to meet the CEOs of these companies. And we said, will you play your constructive role in reducing gun violence? And they did not want to play their role. They had all kinds of answers about why it wasn't their problem and how we should just preach it, Rabbi. Just preach it. It's not your job to fix this problem, just preach it. I don't know what that means, but I'm tired of just preaching it. I'm tired of just consoling the bereaved and bringing thoughts and prayers, right? We've heard that a lot, thoughts and prayers. I'm a rabbi. I'm tired of thoughts and prayers. And they should be tired too. So we had to figure out how are we going to get their attention? How are we going to get them to move? Who are they going to listen to? Any ideas who they'd listen to? Customers. Yeah, customers. So we realized as we did our power analysis, this chart, not too many statistics, I promise, but this over on the right-hand side, 40% of the guns that are sold in this country every year are purchased with your tax dollars and mine by police and military. That's purchasing power. We believe that if this is the story of our campaign in short, if we can marshal the purchasing power of our police and military to say to the manufacturers, we want you to control your worst dealers and innovate in gun safety technology, we think the manufacturers would have to listen. Right? So that's what we're trying to marshal, is this purchasing power of some powerful allies, the police and the military. And so we've been building basically a public sector buying organization, buying group, that can pressure the gun manufacturers on safety. We have recruited, now we're at 124 public officials, mayors and police chiefs and sheriffs and governors, all of whom buy guns across the country, who have said, we will ask the gun manufacturers to play their constructive role in reducing gun violence. We actually held, in 2014, what we believe to be the world's first smart gun show here in New Rochelle, because the New Rochelle police chief at the time had signed on to our campaign. And we wanted to get law enforcement together with some designers of this technology. And there in the basement of the New Rochelle Police Department, we have designers and police chiefs meeting each other and seeing what's possible when it comes to working together. We were involved in getting President Obama a little bit too late in his administration to ask the federal government to look at the feasibility of smart gun technology for federal law enforcement. We've won crackdowns on crime gun dealers across the country. We got Commissioner O'Neill last summer to sign on to the campaign, which is extraordinary because NYPD buys more guns than any other law enforcement agency other than the federal government. Let's see, we're almost done here. So one big part of our strategy is getting police and military to ask the manufacturers to change. The other part of our campaign that we've been working on heavily involves investors, big banks and big institutional investors who invest in gun companies. If they would demand change and responsibility for the gun manufacturers, we think they'll listen as well. So if you have a 401k or a retirement account, you probably own stock in the gun companies. You probably didn't know that. But if you have a diversified account, your account probably has gun shares in it. So we all, in a way, are owners of gun manufacturers. And if we could marshal that power together, we could perhaps make change from within. So we joined our purchasing power together with some big institutional investors, and we got shareholder resolutions passed this past spring in March and just recently in September at Smith & Wesson and Sturm Ruger to get shareholder resolutions passed that demand that the manufacturers report by this spring what they're doing to reduce gun violence both in the area of distribution and safer gun technology. So we think that it's possible to bring together and there's California Teachers Pension, other organizations that are thinking about the way that they invest their money as a way of pressing for change of the gun manufacturers. So you can think about who you know, who works at Vanguard and State Street and Teachers Pension Plans and 529 plans and your bank and investment firm or pension fund. You could think about who you might want to talk to and think about whether they might want to use their purchasing power to press gun companies to act. This is our strategy. People of faith, together with public sector purchasers, that means public officials who buy guns like mayors and police chiefs, and investors, pressing together to get the manufacturers to reduce gun violence by changing the gun industry. That's a very quick run through of our campaign, and I can say more about it. You can think about who you might know, talk to your mayor, police chief, we can help you do that. Think about who you know in the investment business who might be interested in quietly having these conversations. You can follow us on all of the Twitters and find out more about our campaign. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm glad to answer questions.
The first question is, what is the difference between the Episcopalians and the Roman Catholics that accounts for the difference in numbers in gun violence? And the second question is, why did we not address more the power of the NRA?
On the first question, I think, did you mean evangelicals rather than Episcopalians? There's a difference. Yeah. So evangelicals tend to be maybe more fundamentalist type of Christian denominations, or many of the churches that are non-denominational, and they don't have usually bishops or a hierarchy. Many of their clergy aren't really, they go to Bible colleges rather than to seminaries, and they don't always know, they don't study the Greek and the Hebrew, and so there's less training there. To be quite honest, I have a close relative who only has a high school education, worked in a factory all his life, and instead of retiring, he opened up his own church. And he knows nothing at all, really, about Scripture. And so I know that his circle of friends and family are very pro-gun also. So I think the education level difference is important there, as well as just how these churches are structured. So a lot of the evangelicals, they're congregational, so each parish or each church itself, they don't have a connection with other churches in the same denomination and more of a authority that they have to report to.
On the issue of the NRA, thank you for the question. First of all, our strategy is not focused on legislation specifically. So we don't interact as much with senators and congresspeople. But here's the thing. If you want to go after the NRA, the best way to do that is to go after their biggest funders, and their biggest funders are the gun manufacturers. That's where they get all their money. So if the gun manufacturers begin to shift in terms of their sense of maybe some responsibility around this issue, we think that will affect the NRA as well. We have worked to try and get meetings with the National Sports Shooting Foundation, which is actually the trade group for the NRA. Because on their website, if you look there, it says, oh, we're very pro-safety. We really support safety. But when we've tried to meet with them, they say, oh, well, we don't really want to meet with you. So I said over dinner that someone said, also asked that question. It's a very common question. What about the NRA? And our basic answer is, we'll know that we're getting somewhere when the NRA starts reacting to us rather than the other way around. And we don't think there's real productive work to be done in calling the NRA and asking for a meeting.
I would just add that the NRA, if you read about its history, it has changed. It did used to be about safety. And then in the 1970s, 1980s, it changed and became very political. And so that's important to keep in mind. There's a lot going on there, and how it is today is very different than what it used to be. So maybe it could change again. The question is, from a theological perspective, what is the difference between gun violence and other interpersonal related violence? Well, ultimately, people of faith, and I can really speak especially for my own community, we would be against all violence. We long for the day when there will be peace in all forms, in all relationships. In fact, Pope Francis, in his encyclical letter from a few years ago about care for our common creation, the environmental one, it's actually ultimately about peace with the planet as well as peace with people. So we can talk about violence in all sorts of different ways, and ultimately we would want all of these to be addressed. Guns, however, do definitely kill. Some of these other things do not necessarily kill. But so guns seem to be, if you have to pick, from a list of forms of violence to address, I think guns should be at the top of the list. I would also add other things like nuclear weapons. But those that tend to do the most damage and the most harm and cause the most death, I think ought to be addressed. Sort of like triage.
So I heard the two questions was one was around using the language of thou shalt not kill versus thou shalt not murder. And the other is there are so many different organizations, hard to know which to support. You want to take up the first one?
On the first one, yes, I think most scholars with regard to the scriptures agree that that word in the commandment refers to murder. And the Catholic tradition defines murder as the intentional killing of an innocent person. Now, in recent months, as I said, and actually this goes back a few years now, a trajectory's been kind of developing. The papacy has been now saying that even to kill a guilty person is problematic. So Pope John Paul II, he said that not even a murderer loses their being image of God, their dignity as being a human person. So if we can avoid killing even a murderer, we should do so. But the Catholic tradition, as I said, does allow for justified homicide in defense of someone against grave and imminent threat. But that's not murder. But still, that's allowed, that's permitted, that's not something that's celebrated.
On the issue of the different organizations, there are many different organizations that are working on gun violence prevention. Sometimes people say, why don't you all get together and just do one thing, right? And I would say that the answer to that is when you think about the other changes that have happened in society, some of which we never thought might happen, like let's just take things like the reduction of smoking and the introduction of seat belts in cars. If we look at those societal changes, none of those changes happened, and we could point to a lot of others, none of those changes happened because of one campaign or one public service announcement or one lawsuit or one strategy or one piece of legislation. They changed because there were different people coming at the same issue from different angles and putting pressure from all kinds of different angles. So I actually think it's a strength on this issue that there are different organizations working from a bunch of different angles. When we got involved in this issue, we knew that there were lots of organizations already working on legislation, and we're supportive of better gun violence prevention legislation. But we knew that we would never have, we joke sometimes that Mike Bloomberg has been very involved in this issue. The money that Mike Bloomberg is going to take out of his pocket and put on his nightstand when he goes to bed tonight is more money than we'll ever have. So it's great. He's working his own strategy on getting the right legislators elected and the right legislation passed, and we're supportive of that. We're working on focusing on the gun manufacturers, and I actually think it's great that there are different organizations taking different strategies, because we need a whole lot of different strategies to try and make a change. So it can be confusing to know which one to support. I think you have to sort of drill down into what they're doing and how effective you think they can be, and you don't necessarily have to pick one horse in this race. You can support an organization like the Brady Campaign or the Giffords Campaign, and also do not stand idly by at the same time, and because there's a lot of work to do, and we're all going. We do have the same goal in mind, but we have different strategies, and I think that's actually a strength. Great question. The issue of ammunition is another kind of angle on this issue for sure, that if we could have laws that would limit the amount of ammunition people could buy, or the size clip that goes into the gun that would only hold a certain number of bullets instead of 30 bullets in a gun. So I think that's a great idea, and I think there are organizations working on that particular issue.
There is also a gun culture. I have relatives that go to all these shows and they buy and sell guns, and I must just say on that question, a lot of them make their own ammunition too.
Really?
They don't buy it. Yes, and I just saw a story about that recently, and I can't remember the statistics on it, but there are a number of them that's part of the culture, that they actually pride themselves in making their own ammunition.
The observation was that it's astounding to see that there are more suicides by gun than there are homicides by gun. So that would lead me to say that we need additional work on the issue of mental health care. Sometimes people say to me, oh, it's not about the guns, it's about mental health care. And I'm like, well, will you work with me to increase insurance for mental health care? They're like, oh, no, I don't want to do that. But anyway. And the other part of the question was? The efficacy of gun buybacks. So we, in our campaign, spent a lot of time with law enforcement because we're trying to get them to sign on to this campaign. We've asked them that question, and the vast majority of those gun buybacks, from what we understand, I mean, they tend not to. People don't show up with AR-15s at those gun shows, right? Gun buybacks. Mostly, what they get are guns that were living in grandpa's, attic, and maybe they work or maybe they don't work. They don't necessarily get the worst guns off the streets. Every little bit helps, but mostly, from what we've heard from law enforcement, it's a good PR move for the police department. They get their picture in the paper. But it's not real effective to reduce 300 million guns in this country, from what I've understood.
On the suicide question, I'll just say the ready accessibility of a gun increases the likelihood that the suicide's going to be successful, if you can use that word. Other methods of attempted suicide often fail. A gun sometimes fails, but in the heat of a moment, I mean, a lot of, from road rage to somebody that's really severely depressed, feeling like the gun is the only answer, in these moments, if you've got a gun nearby, it's a lot more likely that you're going to die.
The question, and you might have to remind me the order. The last one was about mobilizing kids. The kids have been incredibly inspiring in terms of their mobilization, and we've been together with kids from Parkland in the work that we're doing. So absolutely, I think that however we can draw attention makes a lot of sense. In Israel, you pointed out that even though there are a lot of soldiers with guns, there's not so much access. There's not such a high rate of suicide, and that soldiers are not allowed to take the guns home. It is in Israel. It is almost impossible to get a license to own a gun as a private citizen. So that proves the point in a way, right? In places where you can't get a permission to conceal carry or openly carry, shockingly, there's a much lower rate of gun violence. I mean, it's almost a direct. I mean, I'm not a mathematician, but it shouldn't be surprising that in places where there are many, it's much harder to get a gun, there's much lower rates of suicide and homicide by gun. So we should talk about mental health, we should talk about violent video games, but people in Europe have the same violent video games, they have the same movies, and they have the same rates of mental health issues, I am confident, that we have here in the United States. Their rates of gun violence and homicide by suicide and by gun are much less. And there's only one factor that can define that, and that's easy access to weapons in this country. So those other issues are real things, and we should work on them. But when it comes to the issue of gun violence, it's about the easy access to weaponry.
Please join me in thanking Rabbi Mosbacher and Dr. Winright.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please, indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.